Thanks for joining us on the Real Finds podcast, the podcast series where we chat with key voices shaping the real estate industry and, as a result, our world. On today's podcast, we speak with Jay Tanjuan. Jay is a naval veteran, a successful developer, and an industrial real estate expert. On the podcast, we talk logistics, the Port of Los Angeles, and we gain deep insight into not only what's occurring in the real estate industry, but the future of industrial real estate. Look, if you're a developer, an investor, a broker, or someone that's doing public policy related to urbanization and the industrial real estate space, this podcast is well worth a listen. Jay, thanks for hopping on the podcast today.
Great. Thank you, Gordon. Really appreciate you having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself before we start.
Yeah, sure. Originally from San Diego, California, grew up there, born and raised, and then went to the Naval Academy for college. I ran track there, then did 6 years in the Navy after the Naval Academy. I was a supply officer. Basically, it means I was doing logistics on a ship. So did that for 3 years on a ship, and did a couple deployments out to the Persian Gulf. Then I had some shore duty, and then finished off my Navy career in 2007. And then I went off to business school at UC Irvine. So I did business school there, and I knew, or I felt like I wanted to go into commercial real estate, and so was my focus, and that's what I did my internships in, and ended up really loving it. And then graduated 2009. So if you can recall, the economic environment in 2009 wasn't the best. Probably not too dissimilar from what's happening now, but I think back then it was much worse, I think, for job prospects and whatnot. But through my networking efforts and meeting with a lot of people while I was in school, I was able to find a really solid opportunity doing office tenant rep brokerage with JLL, and that was a really great opportunity for me. I don't think I would have gone that route if the environment wasn't the way it was, but I'm very grateful that I did that path. So I would actually encourage students looking to make a career and jump into commercial real estate. I think brokerage is a fantastic place to start. I just add that as an aside, but it's not the typical post MBA career path that most, I think, choose out of business school, but it was the best for me, and so I did felt like I did well in that field, and I was planning on this was going to be my career, and because development, I think at the time was really there was nothing going on, so I mean that wasn't really a viable path for me at the time. But once I got into brokerage, I was like, this is it. I love this. And then 2011 came along, had an opportunity to join Panatoni Development. And, I kind of turned it down at first because I thought that, I was good with brokerage. Year two, you start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. You're starting doing your own deals. And you already put in all the hard legwork, and now you're starting to see the fruits of your labor after, in that year two mark, from all the cold calling and knocking on doors and all that. So that was really, good experience for me. And that's why I initially turned down the opportunity with the Panatoni job. But after, kind of further research and consulting with mentors of mine, I just said, hey, I think this is probably an opportunity that I don't want to pass up. And, I can always go back to brokerage if it wasn't the right fit. But I jumped in and went all in, and, 2011, there wasn't a lot going on development wise in industrial, but it was starting to see or show signs of life. And if, looking back, I mean, that was pretty much the bottom of the market when I joined. And so as we all know, um, it went straight up.
So I want to cut in there. So
Sure.
I always think it's funny as somebody who I didn't really get fully into the business until the mid 2010s.
Yeah.
Um, and looking back, um, although the market was terrible, right? Like I'm not going to tell anybody, oh, it was
Mhm.
amazing market in 2009. But
Yeah.
the funny thing is, like comparatively, we look back and we see like interest rates were relatively low, like
Hmm.
the price of money was relatively low. There was a lot of potential development opportunity, although monetary supplies were bad. There were a lot of signs that there were green buds kind of popping up all over. Um, uh, do you think there was a reason why, other than fear, that a lot of developers were kind of hanging out or kind of still waiting, or uh, was it just really a fear-driven economy back then for the development world?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's part of that is valid. I think, just there were a lot of layoffs in 2008, 2009. So our industry and most industries got hit pretty hard. So
Oh yeah,
just
oh yeah.
having that fresh in your mind. I mean, it's hard to say let's go all in and start going vertical on projects.
Embrace
So
your inner Warren Buffett.
yeah. So, it's I think that was definitely part of it. And then, back then, consumer demand, was still kind of muddling along, and that's why they had to bring interest rates so low to spur the economy, to encourage business investment, encourage spending by consumers. So, it took a little bit, and then obviously with e-commerce, no one really predicted how big of an impact and how massive an impact that would have in our business and industrial. And that really turned out to be, the key driver to really push this whole thing into the stratosphere
So
this
let's talk a
past
little
decade.
bit. Let's talk
Yeah.
a little bit about that and e-commerce. So, look, Southern California has been very, very much benefited by the e-commerce surge, all the business that's coming from the Far East. What are you seeing in terms of California's growth? What have you seen over the last 10 years in California development, and kind of where do you see the future going in terms of that? Because I think you are one of the best situated individuals with both the brokerage background and the development background to kind of touch on the Southern California real estate landscape.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So like I said, e-commerce has been such a great driver for our business. I think even let's say pre-pandemic, I think market share was about um, you know 15%, and then it post-pandemic got up to in the low 20s. So you know it's also projected to continue to grow. CBRE put out some data, that they're projecting it to get into the 30s in the next 10 years. So, there's still a lot of e-commerce growth and potential that still has yet to be realized. So I think that's going to be a major driver in Southern California. But I think the biggest things. I mean, we have the ports of LA and Long Beach here, which are the largest ports by volume in the U.S. by far. There has been some lost container traffic going to the East Coast during a labor agreement dispute, and then also during the pandemic when there was a supply chain crisis, and you saw the 100 ships lined up off the coast of LA and Long Beach. So there was a little bit of shift, but we feel like that's going to start to come back now that the agreement's been ratified, and there's certainty over the next 6 years regarding the labor issues. But going back to just the ports, I mean, 40% of the goods coming into the U.S. are coming in through those two ports, so it's a significant uh, driver of industrial real estate, because once you bring goods into the ports, they have to be stored somewhere. So where are you going to store them? You got to store them in Southern California warehouses, and then in Southern California industrial just doesn't serve our local population. The region's huge with 24 million people. So we have enough volume and business here to just serve the local region, but we also serve as a jump off point for the rest of the country. So that's a huge thing, and the population is as I mentioned is another big driver. So yes, 24 million people, and you see in the headlines, there people are leaving California in droves, and they're it's a disaster. Everyone's going to Texas and Florida. Yes, to some extent, that is true. There are people leaving, but at the end of the day, I mean, there's still 24 million people. So it's people want to live here, and they come here for the lifestyle, and there obviously there's drawbacks like any other place, but growing up here and also living in other parts of the country. I'm glad to be back and raising my family here. So, it's I got to experience other places, and I felt like this is where I want to be, and I think 24 other million people also feel the same way to some extent. Maybe some of those are gonna leave it here in the near future, but it's a place that people say, hey, where could you live? Where if you could live anywhere in the country, a lot of people, I would guess would say Southern California. So we have that going for us, and the real estate market right now, I think for industrial at least, is in a very challenging spot right now. I think with the rising interest rates that program that the Fed's been doing really to combat inflation really since March of 22 has really started to put a damper on business investment, consumer spending, which is having a direct effect on our business, and not to mention just interest rates. Trying to get construction financing for for a development project is 3 times as much as what it was 2 years ago. So
So
there's a lot of challenges out there right now because of the environment that we're in, and it kind of feels like if you look at the economy as a whole, like everything seems there's economic growth, GDP has been okay. The labor market is still very hot with unemployment at 3.8%, historic lows. But then you look at commercial real estate, banking, lending environment. Those are very challenged areas of the economy right now. So I think those industries are commercial real estate and real estate in general, and the banking industry are taking much of the 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 negative effects of the interest rate hikes and uh, and what's happening now in the overall economy. So
I wanted to talk about some of those unique challenges to Southern California. So I know you mentioned earlier, because look, there's a lot going on, right? I'm not I'm not
yeah,
negging Southern California,
yeah,
but um, what we've seen in the past was we talked about the Port of LA issues regarding labor disputes.
right.
Would you say that most of those are over at this point, and that we can predict now for the next 4 to 6 years that things will probably be hunky dory in Southern California's ports? Or is that something that's a concern going forward for people who are in e-commerce, industrial, real estate, warehousing, kind of in the southern uh, quartile of California?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that because uh, the port agreement just got ratified at the end of August, and so that takes us all the way to July of 2028. So we have certainty and uh, labor peace through then, and also regarding that, the East Coast has their labor agreement that they have to work through. I believe it's September 2024 is when their agreement expires. So they are actively negotiating that now. And as you saw from the West Coast labor negotiations, it doesn't always go as smoothly as possible. The West Coast had a year of uncertainty there where the contract was expired and they were just operating and negotiating the contract at the same time. So it takes some time, and then I think also a big thing what's happening right now in terms of that's affecting the East Coast ports and will I predict will bring back more container traffic to the West Coast ports is what's happening at the Panama Canal. There's a
Yeah.
severe drought that's going on right now, and it's likely extended water restrictions for the next 10 months, maybe longer. So, all that means is, you have typically a bigger ship that would be able to pass through. Now, because of the water restrictions, you can't have those larger ships pass through the canal. So you have to break up that one shipment into 3 shipments. And so all that costs is time and money. So, it's if you're a supply chain professional, you have to look at that and weigh that versus, just it seems like the easier option would be to divert container traffic to the West Coast ports. So that's my feeling there, and especially, like I said, with Southern California, with ports of LA and Long Beach.
I wanted to touch back on kind of the logistics at the port. So the labor situation has been resolved, but one of the big things that all of us Midwesterners and East Coasters kept seeing in the news was the issues that were going on in terms of the logistics at the port due to all the growth and expansion
Mm-hmm.
with moving containerization from ships to trucks to trains. I know I have a background where I actually worked at the Federal Maritime um, organization that monitors a lot of that
Mm-hmm.
in during my time in law school, and so uh, based on my time at the Federal Maritime Commission, I'm just curious, how has that process gone in terms of digitalization, using AI, using automation? Has the port kind of fully wrapped around the ability to handle volume, or are we still kind of going through quirks of rapid growth?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the consumer demand and consumer spending have really kind of tapered off from the supply chain crisis when everyone was at home. There was money being flooded into the economy, so people had nowhere to go, and so they were just buying stuff like crazy online. So that was a very unique situation. So obviously, the system wasn't necessarily prepared for that sort of uh, supply chain issue, and so that has tampered down. And so I think with the port agreement in place, everybody's working full speed ahead and all that. So the backlog issues that you read about and saw in the news are really, I think, at least for the moment, a thing of the past. But we'll see kind of how things continue to evolve. But I also think in terms of like a big thing that we're facing right now, I think, is just at the ports. There's a real push for electric vehicles.
Yeah.
So there's a law that's being enforced here that you basically, by the end of the year, you have to have all your diesel trucks registered into the system, that it's called truckers, TRUCRS. And so all the folks that have trucks that go into the port, they have to have their diesel trucks registered. And then the eventual plan is to have all diesel trucks banned at the ports by 2035. So the big issue is that we don't have necessarily in California the infrastructure yet to accommodate all of these these electric trucks. So
Yeah,
that's going to be yeah,
that's a lot of ampage right there.
right, yeah,
A lot of volts are going through. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so I think California has their own issues, trying to figure that out, and So I think the folks that are really active at the ports and sending a lot of trucks, they're purchasing diesel trucks now to get them kind of grandfathered in until really 2035, because I think typically the life of these trucks is kind of 13 to 15 years, so that takes you right up to that 2035 point. And so I guess you figure it out by then, and maybe the costs start to come down, because right now the electric vehicles or electric trucks are much more expensive, harder to maintain as well than the diesel. But obviously it's cleaner energy, so there's obviously a big push towards that. So I think that's something that we're really going to watch in our industry, because it's going to affect us at some level. It's definitely affecting the users who and occupiers of our buildings, because they're going to have to make those sorts of decisions. And then also from a developer standpoint, we would at some point also include EV charging for trucks in our truck ports. So those are
Yeah.
it's a development that's going to happen. But again, where's the power going to come from? How are we going to generate that? I think they're also counting on, or the state is counting on, offshore wind power. So that technology, I assume, is ready, but to get the permits and get the construction, I mean that takes years and years. And as you know, in California, nothing is ever easy. So I can't imagine, that's going to be a quick process to get approved and to get up and running. So yeah, so it's definitely something to watch. And as things continue to evolve here, we're going to definitely be following it closely.
Yeah, as someone who's worked with developers in a lot of capacities as a broker, uh, it's going to be a huge load on the grid, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that ends up playing out. I wanted to follow up on kind of the similar pattern that we've been talking about, which is design and construction changes and kind of the evolution of logistics and warehousing. And so you're well situated in a development role to kind of be discussing the future of kind of where you see warehouses, particularly in a high growth area, going.
Hmm.
What do you see are like the biggest evolutionary design trends and trends that we will see kind of filter to the middle and kind of other parts of the country as warehouse design improves? I'm guessing automation,
Hmm.
warehouse tech. What are you starting to see?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, because the one of the biggest problems that we have just as an economy overall is labor, right? So that's no different in our world, in warehouse industry, because we need obviously warehouse workers to package, assemble, do all the distribution within the warehouse. So with a labor shortage, it makes it obviously very difficult to run your business. So I think the future is automation, like you mentioned. So automation, really requires Class A buildings. So in LA and Orange County, the average age of a building in our market is about 50 years old. So, and that's across about 1.2 billion square feet of warehouses. So LA alone has almost a billion, or right about a billion square feet, and then Orange County is about 260 million. So it's really 1.3 billion or so total, in warehouse square footage. So, and a majority of it is older, older product. So that does not work well. The older product, the lower clear height, the floors that aren't flat, that have slopes, don't work with robotics. And so that's, I think the future is going to be redeveloping a lot of these older obsolete buildings and creating uh, the true Class A with a super flat floor to help with the robotics, that are going to be, and all the mechanical equipment and everything that's going to be uh, running up and down the aisles of the warehouses. And then also, with the clear height, because you'll be able to stack higher. So that's 32 to 40 foot clear warehouses. So some of these older buildings are 18, 22, 24 foot clear if you're lucky. And so that's just not going to cut it for what's needed. And what's needed is these robotics and automation to really make up for the lack of labor that uh, really the lack of labor that's out there in the market right now. So I think that's a big opportunity for developers here in the future, is to really embrace that. And I think in the short term, it feels like there's a lot of headwinds in terms of construction starts are way down right now because of the economic environment that we kind of previously touched on. But I think once we get past this part of it, the need for Class A is going to be that much more greater to really fill the demand that's going to be there because of e-commerce growth, which is projected, as I mentioned, to grow up to 30% or so in the next 10 years. So you're going to need warehouse workers to do that. But if you can't get warehouse workers, automation, I think, is the future, and that's the answer.
So I know I've been a contrarian voice on real estate Twitter often about forecasting development further and further and further out from metropolitan areas, and that's definitely along that route of thinking where we're starting to see a lot more last mile and infill delivery and redevelopment in Chicagoland. I know that's, at least from my perspective, or I'm guessing that's the future. Um, are you starting to see that? And are you starting to see that from removing of industrial sites, or what we're seeing more is like retail and kind of outdated other asset classes? Is that primarily where we're seeing, and maybe eventually it moves to industrial? What are you seeing in Southern California?
Yeah, I think because of e-commerce, I think we'd like to be closer and closer to the consumer as possible, as you mentioned, for the last mile kind of aspect. Um, I think that's going to be a big thing, because when you're ordering stuff online, people want it faster and faster. So like you're just looking at Amazon, right? They have what Prime used to be like 2 day shipping, then it got to 1 day shipping, and then now you can even get overnight shipping and same day delivery. So that's just getting faster and faster. So in order to meet those needs of the consumer, you're going to have to get closer and closer to the population areas and the urban areas. The issue is that the neighbors and the residents do not want industrial closer and closer to warehouse or to their neighborhoods, but they want the packages faster. So it's a constant battle, and we see that a lot here in our market as well, in terms of the NIMBYism, not in my backyard. There's been several efforts, from a legislative standpoint, to create buffer zones around residential and other sensitive receptors like schools and parks and those sorts of things. So we've seen that year after year. So we expect that sort of pushback to continue. But obviously that keeps getting, for the first couple years, the last 2 years, they've those efforts have been shot down fairly early in those processes to try to get passed into law. So we'll continue to make those efforts through NAOP and other organizations that have a direct effect on warehouse development. So that's something I think we'll continue to push against. And I think for the betterment of the economy, I think we need it. Obviously we need the warehouses to keep goods moving and to keep consumers spending and to keep the economy going.
So I think one of the biggest misconceptions, and I'd love to touch on exactly what you're talking about, is that people see warehouses and industrial as such a dirty word, right?
Hmm.
They imagine like images from like the 1970s Blues Brothers movie of Gary, Indiana, and
Yeah.
smoke and
Yeah.
billowing, at least in Chicagoland, right?
Right. Yeah.
And industrial in the modern age, particularly industrial warehousing and in a lot of areas, just isn't that anymore. I mean, we live in such a clean era of industrial in the United States, particularly post the EPA. And look,
Right.
the EPA in California and Illinois are both pretty tough. So in terms of the warehouse space that you're going to walk into, some of them are clean enough that you could eat off of the floor. And
Oh yeah.
so,
Right.
um, how do developers kind of change that perception? Because I think that's probably the biggest gap to allowing more infill and more safe and clean
Hmm.
infill in a lot of areas that historically have been pretty against industrial.
Yeah, and I think particularly in California, the process that we have to go through is unique to other parts of the country. We have California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. So it's a process that we have to go through, that you have to prove that your development project using science, with math and science, and all the information that we have to prove that the development that we're going to propose is good for greenhouse gas, noise, air quality, traffic. We have to prove all these out, and that's why the entitlements in our part of the world takes sometimes 15, 18, 24 months if you have to do an EIR, environmental impact report. So we have to go through a pretty stringent process, and I think we've also shown that historically the air is actually now cleaner because of all these laws that have been pushed through and forced the development community to adhere to. So like you said, I mean, it's the images of industrial from the back in the day are just a kind of an unfortunate misconception. And so, like, how do we combat that? How do we show that? I think it's just through education and also from being present in the community, and being more involved, because we're obviously, as developers, we're investing in these communities. So we need to also invest in the communities in other ways by you know uh, through education efforts. Like one thing that's a big effort that I'm a part of through NAOP Inland Empire, and also to some extent NAOP Southern California chapters, is that we go out to high schools and we talk to high schools and talk to them about commercial real estate careers, and other just introduce the industry to them. And so, it's at a more of a grassroots level. And I think slowly over time, I mean, that's really what it's going to take. And just sometimes the unknown is creates fear for people. So I think the more present we are in the communities, the more active we are, I think that's going to uh, bode well for us. So I think it's very worthwhile for us to continue to doing and continue these efforts through NAOP and other organizations that are pushing for these sorts of things in our communities. So
Yeah, I think pushing for development through being truly invested in communities is almost always the best way to move forward, because ultimately, and particularly for us, right,
mhm.
at our firm, the way that we operate and the development wing of our firm is a long hold group, and so we don't come in and flip properties. We invest in communities for 30, 40, 50 years. And so to not have that partnership, it just doesn't make sense, not only logistically but financially as well. And
Yeah.
so many more developers, or so many developers would get so much more out of not only their investments but just generally in their careers if they invested in the communities that they were in. So I wanted to follow up. with kind of the whole process in terms of how you find and go through the due diligence and acquisition periods. Um, we certainly can't always mitigate political risks, so we'll take that in terms of understanding if a project is going to get maybe off the ground or not politically, kind of, and put it aside. But what are the key metrics that you use to look at acquiring property, either for infill or for just a general development?
Yeah, so I think the big thing right now, when we're finding new opportunities is we're all you know using a untrended yield on cost number that we're trying to solve to. And so these days it's changed quite a bit from 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, just for some context, I think the untrended yield on costs would probably be in the high fours. uh, and we might not even look at that untrended yield on cost number because rent growth was so strong, and there really wasn't much of a need to look at that metric. But nowadays, I think more than ever, we're really focusing on that metric. And today in Southern California, it's depending on location, but roughly, it's you're solving to a 6 to 6.5 untrended yield on cost for true infill areas. So some of the more secondary markets or secondary areas within Southern California, you'd need to be higher, 6.5, 6.75, 7%, even in some cases. But generally speaking, you're trying to solve to that yield on cost. But the problem is, or one of the problems is that right now with the way the market's going, it's really hard to peg where the lease rates are, because the untrended yield on cost number is the NOI over the total project cost. So if you feel that lease rates are flat or even falling in some cases, that makes it hard to predict where things need to be, and it makes it difficult to determine what price that you can pay for the land. And then I think the other big thing is now a lot of folks, especially on the capital side, capital partners, they're more risk off mentality right now. And
Oh
where
yeah.
2 years ago, everyone was just looking for any reason to do a deal in Southern California. You'd take on entitlement risk. You do, 45-day due diligence and then close in 15 days. Those days are behind us. Those days are gone. So now we need time to get a site entitled and permitted, and basically shovel ready before we can close. So I alluded to earlier, the length of time it takes to get entitlements could be 12 months, 15 months, even 24 months in some cases. So you're asking a seller now, hey, we paid X 2 years ago, but now it's much less now today, and then on top of that, we need time to close. So we're not going to close in 15 months from now, and we're paying 30% less than what it was 2 years ago. So how's that sound, seller? And so a lot of sellers just like, hey, if we don't need to sell, we're not going to sell. So really, you have to find these sellers that have an actual need to sell, and that's created by a life event, like death, divorce, taxes, retirement, those sorts of things, which would cause a need for that particular seller to sell their property. Because 2 years ago and 3 years ago is really just, it was like they're winning the lottery, because it's like, oh, can you hit this price? And oh yeah, sure, we could do that because we have rent growth. We can justify any deal. Debt was cheap and readily available. Equity was readily available as well. So it was a much easier to identify opportunities and then put them together and have them pencil. So these days, obviously, it's much more difficult. You're having to find that right seller, and then if you find that right seller, you have to obviously agree to the new normal and the new pricing and all that. And and if they've been um, you know conditioned to feel that their values were were much higher, it's going to be a lot harder pill to swallow if they're going to have to take a much lower number.
So
So there's a psychological kind of aspect to it as well, that we're battling right now. But we're still kind of in the early stages of this. So I mean, it just takes time for folks to come around, and folks that have to sell are going to sell. If there's a need. So.
So, in conversations with other brokers in a wide plethora of markets, everything from Canadian brokers to brokers on the East Coast to Texas, Florida, the middle in terms of Nashville, Memphis. Every conversation when I talk to folks, it's always that people that are on the sell side are still looking at 2021, early 2022 numbers. I can't tell you how many times I talk to folks that are coming in that we gave offers in 2021, early 2022, uh, based on a bunch of capital that some of my investors were deploying, and say, hey, I'd love to take that offer at 6 million. And we go, your building's not worth 6 million
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's usually not a great conversation. It,
Right.
in terms of that, are you starting to see sellers come down in California, or is there still not a meeting of the minds between the sellers riding high in 2021, 2022, and the buyers who are trying to finance deals at a much different price point now that we're in kind of the 2023 high interest rate environment?
Yes, I think there's a few sellers that have come down, but I think it's still not low enough. I think for transactions to happen. There's been very few land transactions that have occurred in our market, in the past year. Really, it's been very slow from the land acquisition standpoint. There's a few deals here and there that have closed, but for the most part, it's very muted. I think a lot of that is driven by like that yield on cost number that we're solving to with the way lease rates are behaving. There is some pockets of the market have more supply than others, so you start to see those lease rates get affected, and so that hurts your overall equation. And then you're solving to that yield on cost, and now the land number that you're previously asking for needs to be much lower if lease rates are coming down at some level. So it's a tough spot right now. I think you hear about, no one wants to catch the falling knife, right? So that's kind of what it is. And before it was more of a fear of missing out mentality. So now it's more of a fear of being early. But I will say that overall the sentiment is that land pricing has come down quite a bit, and so it's impossible to time the market. No one really knows where the true bottom is. So at some point you have to make some strategic bets and be like, hey, this is a good spot because the market's moved so much. And remember all the things that I mentioned earlier in the podcast, that California, all the great things, and the reasons to be here, and if you're an industrial. So you can't forget those main points, even with all the uncertainty that's out there. So I think it's just something, a unique time in the market. There's a significant amount of fear, a lot of just people watching around, a little bit of herd mentality as well, and waiting for things to start happening. And I think a lot of it is really triggered by what is the Fed going to do, right? So they have obviously been really focused on getting inflation down to 2%. The only lever that they can pull is raising interest rates. Yesterday they just announced that they're going to keep interest rates flat. But hinted at they may raise them again at some point later this year. So I don't think the market really responds to that. The market wants to see more certainty, and until things really start to say, okay, now we're going to set forth a plan to start reducing rates, then I think we'll start to see maybe more activity um, on out there. So
I'm not going to make you uh, play the role of Jerome Powell, but
it's an
I
unenviable job to be in. No, yeah, it takes it from all sides, and yeah, can't win. It's a tough job.
but I will make you play one game before we end, and so that is our final four.
Uh-huh.
Our final four is always a fun opportunity to learn a little bit more about our guests, learn a little bit more
Yeah.
about the market, and learn a little bit more about the real estate world. So the first question of the final four that we always love to ask is, where do you see commercial real estate going 10 years from now? And you can stick it to just Southern California. It could be wherever you see in the market. But where do you see the future going? And you got to put on the Nostradamus cap for at least a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the future for Southern California industrial in the next 10 years is going to be great. I think, as I mentioned previously, with e-commerce market share projected to get to 30% and low 30s in the next 10 years, that's going to bode well for industrial real estate because e-commerce, just the way it's set up in the supply chain, needs more warehouse square footage than just an average, kind of brick and mortar retail operation. So I think that's going to be a big thing. I think that, our population, 24 million people, will take a few hits, but it's not going to be meaningful enough to have a significant impact. So I think that's going to continue to be strong and hold up Southern California industrial really well in the next 10 years. And then the other big thing, as I mentioned earlier, was the automation piece with the labor shortage that we're in now. I don't see that going away anytime soon. So you're going to have automation to really augment your workforce, and also in terms of quality of jobs. That's always been a hit or a knock on warehouse development is the warehouses don't provide quality jobs, but with technology, with AI, with automation, you're going to need some very technical, skilled workers to operate, maintain, and to develop this sort of technology going forward. So I think that's going to be a key thing, and really refute that argument that warehouse uh, uh, industry really doesn't provide quality, high-paying jobs. So that's, I think, going to be a development as well in the next 10 years. And then I don't see the this push in terms of electric vehicles, and that I think that's going to continue to to make its presence known. We're gonna, as a development community, we're gonna have to figure that out and adapt and adjust like we always do, with new technology. So it's not always doom and gloom. I think naturally, most folks are probably just resistant to change, and but it's a change that I think that's coming, and we're at the end of the day, we're all resilient. We'll figure it out, just like we have over the this 200-year history plus of this country. So yeah, so I think there's a lot of things to be excited about for Southern California industrial real estate moving forward in the next 10 years, and it's going to ready for a good long run again.
So I'd like to touch on one thing you said, where you're talking about the warehouse employee is a very different employee than a lot of people who aren't necessarily as familiar with the industry. I was just recently up at a event at our local community college, and they were doing a warehouse employee training session, and many of the employees were learning Python code and were um, retooling machines and retooling automation
Right.
tools, and so
Hmm.
and look, there are many people that work white collar jobs today that didn't have the Python skills that these warehouse workers did, and are paid less. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I think the world of warehousing and industrial, be it metal retooling or all sorts of things that go on, is vastly different than the image that we have of a 1950s or 60s sweatshop warehouse. It's just
Yeah.
not. It's just
Yeah.
not that way anymore.
Right.
And so I I think that's something that really we need to change as an industry, at least how people perceive it.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things that we'd like to change about sometimes is something that we handled in the past. And so one of the things we like to do is take a step back, Jay, into your past. And
Hmm.
so if you could have given yourself 1 minute of advice back in high school, what would that advice have been?
I'll preface that by just saying that I think everything that I've done to this point has also made me who I was. So the mistakes I've made, the things I didn't do, things I did, all contributed to where I am today. So I wouldn't really necessarily change anything, but I will say, and maybe it's just more advice for others rather than in that spot rather than for
You
me.
don't have to.
But
You don't have to really change anything. It's
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, but I would say, because I've always been in sports. I ran track, college and whatnot, and um, you know, I, I think in sports and growing up in sports, like we've always had coaches to get better, help us see things that we didn't necessarily see when we're out there on the field, out there on the court. So I think from a business standpoint, a lot of folks don't really hire business coaches, but I think, if you're trying to get to that next level, the earlier you start and the earlier you start investing in yourself, the better, so I think that's through, hiring a business coach, and yes, it may seem like a lot of money up front, but I think also at the same time, I mean, it's investing in yourself. So it's really, I think it pays for itself you know, in so many ways, many times over. So, that's one thing I think, I would tell myself to read more, because I think, that also contributes just to, just more knowledge um, and maybe when I was younger, I wasn't interested in that. So it just wasn't the right time, right, for me to absorb the material that I was reading. But I just I do audiobooks, so that technology wasn't available back then. So, but audiobooks, I you know every day I'm listening to an audiobook, and it's all nonfiction, all self development stuff that you know inspirational biographies, stories about folks who came from nothing and then somehow persevered and kept going and kept getting up, get knocked down 7 times, get up the 8th time and make it, right? So all that stuff, I'm filling my head with all that positive kind of information constantly. I've cut out all I don't watch any news really. So, other than, news in my industry or, but I'm not sitting around watching like TV or, you know, binge watching Netflix or anything like that, because that doesn't help me get to that next level that I'm trying to get to. And, it's so I've been very conscious of that and really being very intentional about how I, um, uh, you know, structure my day. And so I wish I could do that earlier, but I think that's maybe more advice for the for the next generation who are just getting into
Well, my wife always tries to get me to watch Selling Sunset and Selling the Ocean,
it.
and says,
Yeah.
"Oh, it's real estate, though. Like, you're learning." And I'm like, "Honey, no, 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 no." But in terms of books, you mentioned books, and one of the things we love to do on the podcast is talk about how books really reshape our minds and really kind
Hmm.
of reshape how we perceive the world.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you have a recommendation for one of our listeners out there who's curious about what book they should pick up or plug into their audiobooks next.
Yeah. I have a ton of books that I could recommend, but I'm just gonna give you the last one that I just finished yesterday. Actually, was
That's
uh,
fine. Yeah.
Walter Isaacson's Elon Musk. So it's a
Oh,
brand
okay.
new book that just came out. I read or listened to the Elon Musk biography that was done by someone else previously, but this one was so much more better in terms of it got into more of his the history with his father, kind of history growing up, and the difficulty that he had. We talked about adversity making you who you are. It really shows you, the stuff that he went through as a young kid, the abuse, mental abuse that he kind of went through growing up, really shaped him to to where he is now. Because I mean, the things he's doing is just
Oh, yeah.
just one company that he's built is changing the world, but he's built several. You can go back to PayPal, Tesla, SpaceX. I mean, it's a crazy. And then this new thing, um, I think it's new. I can't remember. Begins with an N, but
Neuralink.
yeah, Neuralink.
Neuralink.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Neuralink.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Neuralink.
Neuralink. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. Like what he's trying to do. I mean, it's basically people with ALS, or they're doing human trials right now. Got approved by the FDA. So I just saw that. So you basically implant this chip, and by a robot does it, and then your thoughts can like move your body. So which is amazing technology. And and then in his spare time he acquired Twitter, now X. So he's running that business. So yeah,
Just in his spare time.
yeah,
Just in his
it's
spare time.
yeah, and I missed the Boring Company, that company that he has, and then I think there's the solar roof company that he acquired, Solar City, part of now integrated it into Tesla. But still, I mean, that's another kind of business line that's just pretty amazing stuff. Obviously he has his flaws, and you say, oh, there's some people say, oh, I would love to be Elon Musk, but you know I think you have to take everything with it. You can't just say I want the the money of Elon Musk, but not accept everything else. I mean, he did go through a lot of trauma in his early years, and he is very difficult, I think, with his employees and stuff. But he pushes them to new heights. So you have to take all of that. You can't just kind of pick and choose what you like about him, I think. But I just thought it was just a really fascinating listen, or read in some cases. But I would highly recommend it. It was a pretty long book, but I can speed up the listening speed a little bit. And but it was really, it was long, but I didn't really want it to end, because it was just really fascinating story, um for one individual to be able to do all this.
Sounds like a great recommendation, but we have one final recommendation that you have to make for us.
Sure.
And the whole reason for the podcast is we seek out men in the arena or women in the arena who are in the real estate field or adjacent to the real estate field, who tend to know other individuals that would be worthwhile bringing on the podcast and talking to. So, what's your recommendation for our next guest?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because there's a lot of potential options. And I would lean on some of the folks that I see active on LinkedIn, in addition to myself. In our market, the first name that comes to mind, Sean Ward with CBRE. You probably know
All
Sean.
right. Yeah.
So he's extremely active on LinkedIn, and has quite a following. So I think he'd be a great addition. Another and Sean's with CBRE. Justin Smith as well. He has his own podcast that he does, but he's also very active on LinkedIn. And I think he'd be a fantastic guest. He's also an author. He's written one book, Industrial Intelligence, and I believe a second one is on the way. And so, I've listened to the first one on Audible, and it's been very highly recommended. So, those are two names in our local market off the top of my head, and happy to recommend more offline. And
Like, those sound like great names,
yeah,
but we have one more question to ask you
sure.
before we wrap up, and that's the second most important question. How does somebody reach out, get in contact with you, Jay, if they want more information, or they want to reach out to you for development advice, or they want to work with you in the future?
Sure. Yeah, I think the best way is just through LinkedIn, and and then we can take it from there. So my profile is readily and easily available to find. Just search my first and last name, and I'm there. And I'll also add, our firm, Scannell Properties, also has a podcast ourselves, Under Development, and I've been the host for the past. We had 6 episodes so far, so we're do it every month, and I think that's just another way to reach out to people and get a wider audience, just like you're doing. And happy to continue doing that. And and like I said, I think LinkedIn is really a great platform. That's the best way to reach me. And then we'll take it offline from there, set up a call or email and all that. But I think that first step is the best way to get a hold of me.
Jay, thank you so much for hopping on, and we'll put all your contact information in there, and we have to have you on in the future.
Great. Thank you, Gordon. Yeah, happy to be a guest anytime. Really enjoyed it, and have a good one.
Thanks again to Jay. If you enjoyed the podcast, please give us a like, a comment, or a review. Your subscriptions, your interactions, they truly matter. They help us with the algorithm and help us continue to get quality guests. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Gordon Lamphere with the Real Finds Podcast. Thank you for listening.